talking about interwar fascism and the rise of Italian fascism. I'll be breaking this podcast into two portions. One on the rise of Benito Mussolini to power, and then the second podcast will be Mussolini's acquisition of power all the way up to 1939. In our last lecture, where we left off on Tuesday, I talked to you about the state of Europe in the interwar period, and I also talked about some of the characteristics of fascism. Let me just repeat some of these points. First off, okay. First off, let's take a look at post-World War I Europe. And we talked about the breakdown of the Russian Empire. We also talked about the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, and most importantly, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Here we're going to see many different countries emerging from the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria already existed. We also have the birth of Albania in 1913 and a new country, Yugoslavia, created in 1919. What do we know about the interwar period? What are some of the conditions? One is that it was a very polarized situation where you have the weakness of democratically elected government, moderate governments, and you've got the rise of extremist parties. The first one would be the Communist Party, as we saw in the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in what is now the Soviet Union, and also the rise of an extreme right party, fascism. Many people talk about fascism in our period today, yet there are certain preconditions of fascism that I think lend itself more clearly to the interwar period, and I think most people have a misunderstanding of what the term fascism means. There are two big debates about fascism, and let me just point these out to you. First off, is that many scholars argue, well, is fascism a concept that can only exist in the interwar period, meaning 1919 to 1939? Can you speak about fascism in previous years? Can you speak about fascism today? So many scholars like to debate this, and I think a lot of other lay people, non-scholars, like to get into that kind of discussion. The second debate that revolves around fascism is the extent to which you can see fascism as a purely European phenomenon. Can you really export this as a concept to other areas of the world? So you've got this kind of debate between historians and, say, political scientists, sociologists, and others saying, well, this concept is really something that applies to people in general. Maybe it's not just limited to Europe. Most of the time, these scholars are going to point to Japan as another case study of fascism in the Far East. So these are the two big debates, whether fascism exists only in a certain period of time in history and whether it is limited geographically to a certain area of the world. So polarization of politics, I want you to kind of keep in mind as I develop my lecture today, because we begin to see these moderate governments, representative governments, unable to kind of control the situation in their respective countries, either strikes, unemployment, economic conditions. And then you also see them internally as not being able to be a cohesive unit. So you see a lot of these governments not being able to maintain a control of their own party. You have fragmentations of party, and also not being able to control the government. A lot of no confidence and a lot of overturn in national governments. So why is fascism so appealing? Why do we see the rise of this specific form of government? And here you need to differentiate fascism from authoritarian dictatorships. Authoritarian dictatorships, which was another very common phenomena in the European landscape, was a leader who basically ruled dictatorially. So either with the permission of an existing monarch or without, they controlled society. What is a fundamental difference between an authoritarian regime, a dictatorship, and fascism? Fascism is a regime that comes to power with a political party, and an ideology. Authoritarian dictatorships have no ideology. It is the leader gives out a command and everyone else is obliged to obey. In fascism, there is actually an epistemological type of foundation that everyone is supposed to buy into. So fascism has a political party. Yes, it has a very strong leader who basically represents the entire government, But there is a party that comes into power, and there is an ideology that kind of serves as a linchpin for what the leader is going to be doing in the regime and during his period in power. As I mentioned last Tuesday, there is no accepted definition of fascism that all scholars accept. However, there are characteristics that scholars do accept. So when I talk about what is fascism, I'm going to give you basically 9 characteristic features. And we went through these on Tuesday. Let me just repeat them quickly. They should be on your outline. Number 1, direct opposition to liberal democracy. Number 2, no personal freedoms, that the person, the individual, is submerged within the greater concept of the nation. We saw this kind of struggle kind of being debated in France during the Dreyfus affair. Here it's been sorted out, and the state wins. The nation as a whole wins. Individuals lose. Number 3, no class conflict, again, because of the unitary function of the nation. Number 4, very anti-communist. Most fascist parties, most fascist leaders have an aversion to communism and use that as a particular means of showing how they will overthrow traditional society. They represent all the evils of a government, so they are completely rejected. Number 5, extreme nationalism, basically trying to resurrect the morale of the people. And they usually harken back to an early period of time, whether in the medieval period or going back into antiquity. And so for Italian fascism, they go back to the Roman Republic, they go back to the Roman Empire. So you're going to see a lot of this going back to the glories of, to kind of raise their morale and their sense of well being. Number 6, exclusion and discrimination against minorities. So this does not just mean one minority, there are groups of minorities. And this is why many scholars actually say, to what extent can we actually use Nazi Germany as an example of fascism, because they really were extreme in certain areas. So they're wondering if they're kind of off the charts or belong in the charts of the general discussion of fascism. Number 7, and this is critical to differentiate between authoritarian dictatorships and fascist regimes, and that is imperialism. That every single fascist regime has a vision of territorial expansion that is linked to this national kind of linkage back to antiquity or the medieval period. So you see a very militarized society and one that says we need to expand. In Italy, what was it? It was La Mare Nostrum, the Mediterranean Empire. For German, it's going to be the Third Reich and Lebensraum to the east. Number 8, strong, highly centralized government. It's basically a one-man rule. Number 9, most of the support is achieved through the center right of society. And they work with the most conservative elements of society to gain as much acceptance as possible. And the last one, and I should have said 10 characteristics, to eliminate class conflict so that everybody's participation in society serves the needs of the state. So individual rights are set aside, everyone must come together to serve the goal, and that is the state itself. So why is Italy so susceptible to fascism? And this is something that most people say fascist regimes emerge from those defeated countries from World War I. Italy technically was a victorious power. Psychologically, many of the leaders and elites talked about, quote, a mutilated victory, meaning that Italy was part of the victorious side, yet got so little in terms of territorial compensation that they actually felt psychologically like a defeated country. So going into the minds of society and of the leadership really gives you kind of insight into how they were sensing themselves. So on the books, Italy was part of the Allied forces victorious. Internally within Italian society was a different picture. So you had number 1 for Italy. The 1920s was a period of high unemployment for returning war veterans. There were also disruptive strikes crippling the Italian economy. This is going to be echoed in Germany 10 years later. We're going to see this as well. Number 3, liberal and middle class politicians lost control of the state. They could not control their own parties, they could not control any coalition, and they could not exert an agenda. Case in point, in Italy, there were 4 different national governments in a period of 3 calendar years. So basically, there were 1, if not 2 elections per calendar year. And fascism is going to be appealing because it's going to offer stability. It's going to offer a revival of Italian morale, Italian strength, trying to revive the Italian economy. So it seems as, or it portrays itself as a harbinger of stability, strength, and prosperity. We'll see how that kind of language is actually carried out. And let's take a look at the person we're going to be examining, and that is Benito Mussolini, who's going to be the leader of the fascist regime. He calls himself the first fascist leader. Yes, he is the first national fascist leader, but there's some other aspects to his story. What I want you to keep in mind as I lecture about his background, and I selected this deliberately, is notice the transition Mussolini is going to make. He is going to grow up as a committed socialist, but by 1915, he's going to start, 1914 actually, he's going to start to make a transition to the right fascist leaning kind of ideas. So notice this arc. So when I begin and I tell you he was an editor of the socialist newspaper, you're going to say, well, how? But I thought he was fascist. He goes through an incredible transformation. So notice this transformation as I lecture. Mussolini was born on July 29th in 1883 in the Romagna region of Italy. His mother was Catholic. She was a school teacher. His father was a blacksmith. He was also an alcoholic. He was also a womanizer. The family could be characterized as left-leaning, so socialist-leaning, and predominantly socioeconomically as a working-class family. Benito Mussolini, as a child, was a very violent, erratic type of child. He was prone to bad behavior. And as much as his mother was a school teacher and tried to get him into nice private schools, um, he got into fights and he was kicked out of a private school because he stabbed 2 of his schoolmates. So from the very beginning, Mussolini kind of evidenced a propensity to violence. In 1902, after he managed to finish up his high school education, he went to Switzerland. Many people argue that perhaps Mussolini did it as a way to avoid going to war, or not going to war, but to serve the military, an obligatory service. He said, no, I didn't avoid the draft. At this point, what was his outlook on life? He was an atheist, so he believed in nothing. He was anti-clerical, meaning he did not like the church. While he was in Switzerland, he decided to sign up for a program at the University of Lausanne. It was in 1904. It was a summer session for him to get his master's, so a master's in education. He went back to Italy in January 1905. There he served his obligatory military service, which was 18 months. During this time, though, his mother passed away at the age of 46. Since he delayed entering the military, he was kind of on strict control and he was not even allowed to go to his mother's funeral. He had a very unique type of relationship to his mother. We don't have time to go into that. After he finished up his military service, he decided in 1906, September, he was released from the army, he wanted to teach, he wanted to become a school teacher, kind of to follow in the footsteps of his mother. Unfortunately, his disposition and his behavior is dramatically different than his mother's. When he went into the classroom, he was kind of like a tyrant. He used foul language, he drank, he slept around with the other school teachers, and at this time actually contracted venereal disease from one of these school teachers. His behavior was so unprofessional that at the end of that academic year, so the spring of 1907, the headmaster of the school said, thank you very much, Mr. Mussolini. Thank you for your services. We won't be needing you next year. So in a polite way, he was fired. His outlook at this time, he began to be drawn by a very prominent philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche kind of espouses this idea of the superhero, the strength in society. He kind of looks down upon the intellects very much. So you see this kind of strong leader, strength, power through physical strength a lot. Hitler's also been attributed to liking Nietzsche as well. So we see Nietzsche as another link between these 2 dictatorial leaders. So after he got dismissed from being a school teacher, he decided to get involved in journalism. And he started to become like a journalist in a newspaper called La Lotta di Classe, Class Struggle, which is a socialist newspaper. And in 1911, when the Prime Minister of Italy, Giolitti, decided to invade Libya, he immediately started writing articles about how this was a colonial war, this was a capitalist type of war, kind of using a lot of Marxian terminology, and he really despised it. So he tried to get a lot of anger from the Italians against this war. He protested the war and was arrested in his protest. You can imagine how violent it was, and was sentenced to 5 months in prison. So here's another similarity between Mussolini and Hitler. Both are going to serve prison times. Afterwards, he formally entered and joined the Socialist Party and participated in the July 1912 National Socialist meeting, so different than nationalist socialism. His participation at this national meeting got him an editorial position in the national newspaper for the Socialist Party called Avanti, meaning forward. And Mussolini was really gifted at boosting readership because he made a deliberate break from past editors. What did previous editors do? Basically, they talked about Marxian and communist ideology, so they were very much focused on theory. What did Mussolini do? He downplayed the theoretical portion and started talking to people about their daily experiences, the exploitation that occurred at the factories for everyone, something that people could identify. And this, he really got a lot of people to read the newspaper. And he's going to stay in the Avanti as editor from 1912 to 1914. He decided to break and leave the Socialist Party and the newspaper because of World War I. For Mussolini, and here, let's see, we'll go back to this. Mussolini as editor. He began to see that with the German invasion, remember when I talked about the Schlieffen Plan, the Battle of the Marne, which basically inaugurated trench warfare and the extensive nature of World War I, Mussolini began to see that Germany was most likely not going to be able to win the war. And he said for Italy, which was neutral at the time, it didn't make sense to stay neutral. The Socialist Party was against entering the war. What other major institution in Italy was also against the war? And that was the Catholic Church. So both of these were very much, and the Catholic Church actually called it a useless slaughter. But for Mussolini, he found this as an opportunity. And so he broke with the Socialist Party and he began to envision Italian territorial gain. So here we begin this transition. So he resigned October 18th, 1914, and said neutrality in the war was wrong. He then, 1 month later, started a new newspaper on his own, Il Popolo d'Italia, the Italian people. And this was funded by Western countries, very wealthy industrialists. And he used this newspaper as a way to kind of encourage Italy to join the war, and especially on the side of the Allies. Its first publication was in November 15th, 1914. So Mussolini was very much agitating for intervention into the war. He was very he not only talked about it, but by 1915 he was conscripted into the army. He wanted to participate. So for him, it was not just so much as talk, but he was going to have actions behind his words. So he was conscripted in September 1915. How did his superiors view his participation on the battlefield? They were, quote, unimpressive participation. So while Mussolini talked about the strength on the battlefield, his strength in his masculinity, what he actually did on the battlefield was not that impressive to his superiors. In February 1917, he was injured on the front. He called it, this injury when it was taken back to the hospital, quote, the most beautiful moment in my life. So he presents it as active combat. What do we actually know happened to him? He was wounded by an overheated grenade thrower. So it's not because he was being assaulted by German troops or was in the middle of fire. Basically, his own equipment malfunctioned, and that's how he got out of the war. His injuries were so severe that he was actually taken out of future combat. So this was from 1915 to 1917, February in particular, was Mussolini's military participation. He then goes back to editing Il Popolo d'Italia. And here he begins to really, he captivated the population when he talked about his anger over the Italian defeat at Caporetto. Now, Caporetto is in the northeast part of Italy between Trieste and Venice. And when the Russians took out their troops, and you can understand why, because of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Italians are basically on their own. And on October 24th, 1917, the Italian forces were defeated. Mussolini was absolutely outraged. He was especially targeting the officers who were in charge of the campaign. He said these were incompetent individuals. How could they let the Italian soldiers down? And he tried to kind of encourage the soldiers to keep on fighting. The following year, he kind of latched on to the Italian victory at Vittorio Veneta, back to the same territory. So October 1918, we do see some Italian gains there. So he's able to kind of promote himself as a champion of the Italian military, the champion of Italian morale, and kind of very much anti kind of weak leadership. So he's kind of juxtaposing himself against weak officer leadership by saying how strong he would be. So by the end of World War I, 1918, we find Mussolini's attitude as quite different. It has transitioned from socialist, meaning atheist and anti-war and working class, to that of fascism. And he calls his newspaper a newspaper of combatants and producers. So he's going to start to move over to more of a militaristic and more of a holistic kind of national type of entity. And when Mussolini looks at the Paris Peace Treaty and sees what was given to Italy, he is the one who really harped and really emphasized how Italy got a mutilated peace. They didn't get anything. They should have gotten Trieste. They should have gotten other territory, but they didn't. And he was very much against the League of Nations. He said Italy should not be joining the League of Nations because, why? It was a hindrance to Italian ambitions and territorial expansion. He also perceived the League of Nations as kind of like a way for the Western countries to dominate, to have hegemony over the others, and to promote their agenda at the expense of the weaker countries. So here we begin to see Mussolini, making a complete transformation. So 1911, he was against, he wrote about how he didn't like Giolidi's war into Libya, but by this period, he was very much a promoter of Italian imperialism and colonization. No sooner that we see the Paris Peace Conference is kind of being sorted out, that Mussolini, or in the midst of it, that Mussolini creates his own political party. So for him, the logical next step from journalism is to actively get engaged in the political process. On March 23rd, 1919, he starts his own political movement. He calls it the San Sepolcrista because the first meeting of his movement was held in a building right on the Piazza San Sepolcro. Why did he not use the term fascism? He could not claim his party was called the Fascist Party because it was already appropriated by other groups. Within the period from 1919 to 1921, Mussolini's San Sepolcrista party is going to begin to infiltrate the existing fascist groups and co-opt them into his movement. So by 1921, he can actually say he has a fascist party. He can also say, he's on very kind of weak ground on this, to say his was the first Italian fascist party. He could say that only because he incorporates the very first fascist party, the one that preceded him. So since he co-opts and includes it in his, and he's a leader, he tries to make the argument that his was the first one. In the San Sepolcrista in 1919, who were the members of this party, this movement, as he talks about? Futurists, and this was a very much political intellectual movement that many scholars say are the foundations for fascism. And this is why they always use movement, because there's this emphasis on action. And you even see this replicated in art, this very kind of like strength, trains moving. You kind of see this blurred image of speed because it's always something in movement. They don't want anything static. So you have futurists, anarchists, communists, syndicalists. That means people like labor unions, Republicans, Catholics, nationalists, and liberals of various kinds. So when looking at the membership of Alianza por la Crista, you don't see any emphasis on a particular political ideology. Basically, he's trying to get anybody who would support him. He would take anybody and anything. What is Mussolini's main claim at this point? That his party, his members were libertarian above all, that they loved liberty. And notice the hypocrisy of what we're going to see after 1922. They loved liberty even for their political enemies, that they were against censorship, and they supported free speech and thought. What was the platform of the Alianza por la Crista? Land to the peasants, workers' representation, progressive tax on capital, expropriation of land and factories, votes for women, greater inheritance tax, confiscation of excessive war profiteering, nationalization of armaments industry, and large-scale decentralization of government. Basically, any political agenda to meet any political interest. In June of 1919, he tried to get onto the national stage to gain name recognition by opposing the Prime Minister, Salvatore Nitti, in June of 1919, especially because Nitti was not a supporter of Italy entering World War I. Now, the Nitti government was a coalition, and he tried to chip away and create weakness between the coalition factions. And also, he began to circulate rumors of him trying to take over power. So already Mussolini is sowing the seeds in 1919 of a coup d'etat, meaning a takeover of power. And there were also rumors circulating about a particular town on the border of Italy, Fiume, and Croatia, that the Italians had wanted. Let's go through the PowerPoint a little bit. Family map. Now, this is a very interesting type of image because Mussolini was actually he was married to someone else before his wife. She was a very much an intellectual, wealthy, socialist-leaning woman who kind of encouraged him, guided him in his political path. They even had a son, Benito Mussolini Jr. The woman later on, she was discarded to marry his current wife, as you see on the PowerPoint. She was put in a mental institution and she died. The son was injured on a boat. You could take it any way you want. Here's an image of the first wife, and this is his son, Benito Jr. So both were disposed of once they were no longer useful. Going back to his wife, while he was an atheist after 1922, he made this attempt to court the Catholic Church to get his marriage blessed, to have all of his children baptized in the Catholic Church. So we're going to see a complete about face of Benito Mussolini. So a very tragic end to his first wife, and especially his son. Here was an image of Mussolini on the battlefield. So this is what he looked like in World War I. And let's get now to Fiume. So I have this little, you see Fiume with a little arrow on the border of what is now Croatia, what was then Yugoslavia, and Italy. So Fiume was a city that the Italians considered to be solid Italian soil, should have been given to Italy, should not have been given to Yugoslavia. So there were a lot of rumors, not only of Mussolini trying to take over government, to have a more stronger regime, but also there were rumors of an attempt to capture the town of Fiume, sorry. And this actually did occur in September 1919. However, it was not by Benito Mussolini, but rather Gabriele D'Annunzio. And Gabriele D'Annunzio was a very charismatic right-wing type of a leader. And he basically stole Mussolini's thunder because they had a very similar platform, yet D'Annunzio beat him to the punch, so to speak. So D'Annunzio was supported by members of the Italian army, conservative elements of society, And absolutely nobody stopped him in his capture of Fiume. Neither Italian governmental forces nor Yugoslavian forces stopped him from entering the city. He too was supported by futurists, nationalists, anarchists, and even some socialists. Let me show you this. Here's Fiume and the welcoming of D'Annunzio and the Italian troops. Everybody was celebrating this Italian acquisition post Paris Peace Conference, post World War I. The only one on the Italian peninsula who was not happy about this was Benito Mussolini. Why? Because he was not the one leading the charge. So he was very much concerned that Gabriele D'Annunzio, his political star, was on the ascendant. He would capture the electoral base that Mussolini was courting. So in one way or another, he had to deal with his competitor and eliminate him. And so he's going to do something very similar to what he did to the First Fascist Party, basically make friends with Gabriele D'Annunzio, kind of co-opt him into the membership, and then downplay him and assert authority. Think about Napoleon Bonaparte in the Directory. And here are the Italian troops, very happy. You see the images there. And later on, we have Benito Mussolini on the left, D'Annunzio on the right. So he's going to try to present to the public a very kind of united front. But in this friendship, he's going to use D'Annunzio and downplay and marginalize him so that he would gain the spotlight and the dominance over the electorate that he's courting, that both of them were courting. So Mussolini is now going to enter the electoral field, and he's going to participate in national elections. And in the elections of November 1919, Mussolini did not do very well. Campaigning on his Senza Policrista platform, trying to appeal to everyone, going around just asserting what his agenda would be, was actually a disaster. That nobody from the Senza Policrista was elected, not even Mussolini himself from his home village, hometown. So here, Mussolini and his party members are going to have to rethink how they're going to approach elections and party or political participation. And here they come up with a program that is going to be the characteristic feature of fascist political participation and will be seen from the very beginning with Adolf Hitler as well. Hitler is going to see, learn, and adopt what Mussolini is going to do from 1919 to 1922. And that is, Mussolini is going to embark in violence. What type of violence? Kind of anarchist violence. And who is he going to target? The strongest political party opposing him, and one with a very similar electoral base to what he was trying to capture. What is this party? The Socialist Party. The socialists are those trying to appeal to kind of lower class individuals, working class individuals, former war veterans, and yet the socialists are trying to bring them into an ideological sphere of kind of pseudo-Marxism, talking about exploitation, so going in that direction. Mussolini rejects that as he did in 1914. He wants to capture that same electorate. So how is he going to do that? He's going to try to kill socialist leaders. He's going to intimidate other individuals so that this electorate will slowly, or actually in his case, rather quickly, vote for Mussolini. So after the elections of 1919, Mussolini begins to employ his violent tactics for elections. What does he do? As there was a socialist victory parade in his town, a group of his members threw a bomb at the parade to blow it up. His party also decided to mail bombs to the Cardinal Archbishop of Milan and also to the socialist mayor. Mussolini and others were arrested for their participation in these bombs and what they're trying to kill others. But what were the charges that were leveled against Mussolini and others? What is it? Attempted murder? Was it terrorism? Was it treason to the state? No, they got the most minor sentence or arrest possible. And that was basically they were arrested and convicted for arms possession. Very, very mild in comparison to what they should have. They were arrested, charged with that, and then let go the next day. So this was an ominous sign of what was to come. Mussolini saw that his tactics of violence and even death actually had very little to no consequences for him and his party members. Yet it was very unsettling to his opponent. So he saw this as the perfect recipe for his ascent to political power. So 1919, where we begin, his fascist party in November had fewer than 4,000 members. Yet this is going to dramatically change around with this new approach to political participation. So we start to see not only a change in his political approach and political behavior, but also his ideological leanings. In 1920, he abandons his atheism and moves towards clericism, meaning support of the church, support of the Catholic belief, outwardly at least. He also approached Gabriele D'Annunzio about possibly kind of joining forces to overthrow Giolitti. By 1921, we begin to see Mussolini not only ascending dramatically, but also another opportunity presenting itself for him. And that came by way of a split inside the Socialist Party. So we see a split, a fragmentation on the side of the left that Mussolini is going to kind of build on. So the elections of May 1921, we see the fruits of Mussolini's labor. Mussolini and his fascist party were brought into the Giolitti coalition government. Why would Giolitti even consider bringing in Mussolini? He was one that tried to blow up people. He was a dangerous individual. Why would he be brought in? And this goes back to my initial points regarding the interwar period. There was such a fear of the rise of communism, beginning with the Bolshevik Revolution, beginning with the two attempted communist overthrows in Germany, and also the attempted one in Hungary and elsewhere, that Bolshevism, communism, was perceived as a growing threat and one that undermined Western and conservative society. Everything people understood about society, religion, private property, and a hierarchy of leadership would be completely destroyed by the communists. So this to them was such a big fear that they would rather use that's what they were thinking, this term, use the fascist party to deal with the extreme left. So they wanted to play the fascists off against the left. So they would rather work with the fascists since to them it seemed like the fascists supported traditional society, they supported the church, traditional family roles. They didn't try to change that they ideologically were the closest, and so they would use them to kind of deal with the socialists. Unfortunately, for most of these political leaders, I'm going to see it again with Hindenburg in Germany, what happens? They are going to be taken out of power and the fascists are going to take over. So instead of these elected, democratically elected leaders using the fascist party, the fascists are going to overthrow the elected leaders. When Mussolini comes into this coalition government, does he stop kind of terrorizing the socialists and the communists? No, he actually steps up his campaign against them. Mussolini also goes to Giolitti and tells him, let me take care of any strikes. Let me put down any fears of a communist overthrow. So he tries to portray himself. He actually sees what Giolitti wanted and says, I'll do it. I want to do it. Let me put down this unrest. There's a question that I hope you guys are thinking. Why would Mussolini attack socialists but not communists so much? And because there are two factors. One, that the communists, oftentimes these parties are deemed illegal and they have to become underground groups. They are also, secondly, numerically very small. So that the communists who do not want to participate in government, basically they just want to overthrow government, don't have as many people supporting them. The socialists, on the other hand, want to work within government. They are also extremely powerful. They have stronger numbers. And so they would actually be able to take over government. There were many socialist governments in Italy. So if you think about it, they are the biggest threat. That they combine both the ideology that the fascists hate. And also, they're resentful of the fact that they are so popular. So they're going to step it up. And also, the strikes during this period are going to give an opportunity for Mussolini to say, hey, let me take care of them. These are a bunch of communists over there. So the ideology, so Mussolini is doing this. And in 1921, we see the final shift for him, and that is kind of explaining his ideology. So in August 1921, he creates the Fascist School of Culture in Milan. So the articulation of fascist ideology is basically formalized in August 1921. So Mussolini by 1921 has made a complete transition, abandoned everything he knew in the past of socialism, had come full circle and adopted everything that we understand as being fascist. So from August 1921 to October 1922 is basically a period of Mussolini preparing and trying to carry out his own takeover of power. So everything on Mussolini's mind in this calendar year is all about getting rid of the Italian Prime Minister Giolitti, and then we're going to have Facta. He's going to be the last Italian Prime Minister, and for Mussolini to take over. So we have fascist ideologies completely cemented. He is also going to create his own type of paramilitary group called the RAS, R-A-S. These are the black shirts. This is kind of like his semi-illegal group that carries out all of the violence. So long as the sitting government does not put them in prison, they can basically do whatever they want, kill anybody they want, blow up socialist political headquarters anytime, and nobody would be held accountable for them. So you have the Ras, basically agrarian fascist thugs. They were called squadristi, and they are characterized as wearing black shirts. So Hitler in Germany is going to adopt this, and he's going to call them his brown shirts, as we're going to see. In February 1922, the final democratic government is going to be elected in Italy. This brings Luigi Facta, and he also does not govern with a majority vote. His own political party did not have a majority in the elections, so he has to operate within a coalition, meaning a group of parties that are kind of ideologically similar. Luigi Facta also continues the approach that Giolitti did by trying to use Mussolini to kind of fight against the socialists and the communists. In August of 1922, the socialists tried to organize a national strike, a general strike across Italy. This was their big attempt to reassert control, to kind of push back against the violence and uncontrolled behavior of Mussolini and his fascist thugs. Unfortunately, this strike did not have the support by the people as was expected. It was basically weak. It was kind of scattered, and it basically played into Mussolini's hands. Mussolini and his quote unquote strike breakers basically quashed every single kind of attempt for a strike and really gathered up and beat up all of the socialist leaders. They destroyed all of the socialist printing presses, and it absolutely broke the morale of the socialists throughout all of Italy. The fascists had won. Their strike did not have popular support. They were being vandalized, and their leaders being pressured, if not beat up or killed. So from this point on, from August 1922 to the end of October 1922, Mussolini now considers himself the strongest leader and begins to organize his takeover of power. Mind you, this is occurring at the same time that he is participating in the Facta government. So on the one hand, Mussolini quietly is going to be laying the groundwork for his takeover of power. But on the other hand, he's going to be telling Facta, oh, those rumors, don't believe them. These are people who are jealous of our relationship, basically trying to downplay, if not outright lie, to Facta about his true intentions. By the fall of 1922, so we start September, he's making the final arrangements for his coup d'etat. His biggest concern, that is Mussolini, was that would the Italian military, specifically the army, rise up against them to defend and support the freely elected government of Facta, or would they join forces with Mussolini? So what did Mussolini do? He decided to approach retired war generals, people who would be discreet and who would be a good sounding board for Mussolini. And he said to them, I propose to take over government. I will restore strength, stability, morale. I love the military. We need to rise up again. We've been abused by the Western powers. Do you support me? And these retired generals basically said, we support you. From what they asked other individuals, they got a very similar response. By getting this, sounding out the military, Mussolini could then, within a space of days, now organize his march on Rome. This military takeover of power, called the March on Rome, was going to occur on the evening of October 27th, leading into the 28th. He was going to get all of his soldiers, all of his supporters, all of his party members to march from Milan all the way down to Rome. And so he gets everybody. And he gives the signal at 2 o'clock in the morning. So 2 o'clock in the morning of October 28th, he is going to give the signal for the march. Facta, who, of course, listened to Mussolini and said, okay, said to him, I acknowledge what you tell me that you're not going to overthrow, was not a stupid man. And he understood the true intentions of Mussolini. When the signal was given at 2 o'clock in the morning, and Facta had known about this, he immediately goes to the king, Victor Emmanuel, and he said, I need an emergency meeting with you, and requested from Victor Emmanuel martial law, the ability to put down Mussolini's march, attempted takeover, and reassert control over Italy. And here the king gave it to him. Unfortunately for the government, the prefect of Milan, the leader, the democratically elected leader of Milan, Alfredo Lucignoli, was told that by Mussolini, if you ignore any martial law request by Luigi Facta, if you ignore it, I promise to give you a very high position in my new fascist regime. Lucignoli took a look at the situation and sided with Mussolini. He ignored the command for martial law and to put down Mussolini, which basically allowed Mussolini's march to actually occur. This gave a decisive support to Mussolini and his takeover of power. Here, what started off as a small kind of march began to gather steam. By 9 o'clock in the morning of October 28th, Victor Emmanuel brings Facta to his office and he rescinds, meaning overturns, the martial law permission that he had given him. What does Facta do? He immediately resigns. The march on Rome comes down all the way to Rome. And where is Mussolini in all this? Is he at the front of his march on Rome? Actually not. When he gave the signal in the early hours of October 28th, Mussolini himself was on the border of Switzerland, so that in the event the martial law was upheld and his march was a failure, nobody would capture him. So even Mussolini was not even sure of his own march on Rome. So all of his supporters marched to the capital, but it's going to take a day for Benito Mussolini to come by train to the capital to assume the position of Prime Minister of Italy, October 29, 1922. Benito Mussolini becomes the 27th Prime Minister of Italy at the young age of 39. He didn't have the troops or the supporters in his march on Rome, as he leads people to believe. He says there were hundreds of thousands, but there were more tens of thousands. So Mussolini comes to power, and here we're going to see a complete transition. He's going to take over as prime minister. He's going to fix elections. And then he's going to use the situation to his advantage to become Il Duce, the permanent leader, fascist leader of Italy. I will talk about Mussolini's tenure in power in our next podcast. So, to sum up this podcast, I've talked to you about the characteristics of fascism, the general characteristics of Europe. I hope you see the arc of transition in Mussolini's thought and how his political participation in his rise to power is going to be adopted by others, and he can claim to be the first elected fascist leader of the world. Thank you very much for joining me on this podcast. I'll see you soon.